At dawn, the road appears before the sun does. A narrow ribbon of asphalt clings to a vertical wall of stone suspended hundreds of meters above empty air. Trucks move first, their engines echoing off sheer rock tires, tracing a line that should not exist. Wind presses against guardrails. Loose gravel skitters into nothingness. Below, the valley is silent, distant, irrelevant. Every day, thousands pass here without ceremony. Food, fuel, steel, time itself. If this road closes, entire regions slow down. Detours stretch for hours. Costs multiply quietly. Lives reorganize around absence. No monument marks this place. No warning explains why a mountain was cut open to keep vehicles moving forward. The cliff only shows scars, straight, deliberate, irreversible. What you are watching is not a stunt or a symbol. It is a choice that is still being lived with. If you follow stories where infrastructure shapes destiny, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing. The road. The decision sounds wrong the moment it is spoken aloud. Instead of going around the mountain, the plan is to go through its face. Not beneath it, not over it, but directly into the cliff itself. The mountain is treated not as an obstacle to respect, but as a surface to be split. In most places, vertical rock is a boundary. It ends movement. It dictates routes limits, trade shapes, settlement. Here, that logic is reversed. Engineers do not accept the cliff as final. They redraw it. From a distance, the result looks fragile, even reckless. A road pressed flat against stone that once fell freely for centuries. Vehicles moving where only birds and weather belonged. The line between terrain and infrastructure dissolves. Nothing about this solution aligns with instinct. Gravity is unforgiving. Rock is unstable. Maintenance is endless. Any failure happens publicly and violently. There are easier options that feel safer on paper, longer routes, slower routes that obey the mountain. Yet this is the option that keeps returning. Not because it is elegant, not because it is cheap, but because it shortens distance in a country that measures itself in movement. Because it converts isolation into access. Because in certain places, refusing to cut the cliff means accepting that entire regions remain peripheral. The paradox is simple and unsettling. To preserve connection, the landscape itself is broken. In the American landscape, distance is rarely abstract. It is counted in fuel in hours, in missed deliveries in communities that drift just far enough away to be forgotten. Mountain regions feel this pressure first. Roads that follow natural contours stretch endlessly. What looks reasonable on a map becomes punishing in reality. A detour of 50 extra miles is not an inconvenience when repeated once. It becomes one when repeated every day by every truck in every season. Winter closes passes. Rockfalls block switchbacks. Fire cuts corridors without warning. When a single route fails, towns do not merely slow down, they disconnect. For decades, these regions adapted by shrinking expectations. Fewer suppliers, limited medical access, higher prices for the same goods. Young populations leaving first because movement determines opportunity. None of this appears dramatic enough to demand headlines. It accumulates quietly. At the national scale, the pressure compounds. Supply chains depend on reliability more than speed. A single unpredictable segment forces redundancy elsewhere. Warehouses grow larger to absorb delay. Fuel consumption rises to compensate for inefficiency. What begins as a local geographic problem becomes a systemic cost distributed across the economy. There were alternatives, and they were studied repeatedly. longer routes that looped through gentler terrain, seasonal corridors that accepted closure as normal, infrastructure that tolerated isolation instead of confronting it. Each option had one thing in common: it preserved the mountain by sacrificing time. Eventually, time became the scarcer resource. As traffic volumes grew and logistics tightened, the margin for unpredictability disappeared. Emergency services needed direct access. Industries required year-round movement. Entire regions faced a simple equation with no elegant solution. Either the road became shorter and more reliable, or the area accepted permanent limitation. The choice was not framed as ambition. It was framed as containment: prevent further economic drift, prevent depopulation, prevent the quiet costs that never appear in budget hearings but shape outcomes for generations. Cutting into a vertical cliff was not the first option considered. It was the last one that still functioned. In places where geography offered no compromise, engineering stepped in to manufacture one. The necessity was never heroic, it was procedural, a response to pressure that had nowhere else to go. This was not the first time Americans tried to force roads through impossible terrain. Long before modern machinery, similar ambitions surfaced wherever mountains compressed movement into narrow corridors. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, early road builders carved ledges by hand. Crews hung from ropes, drilling shallow holes into rock faces with steel and muscle. Explosives were crude and imprecise. One mistake fractured entire sections of cliff. Another buried equipment for months. Progress was measured in feet, sometimes inches. Many of these routes never reached completion. Others opened briefly, then vanished under landslides, frost, or neglect. Maintenance demanded constant presence, and budgets rarely survived the first decade. When storms arrived, there was no redundancy. Roads closed. Communities adapted by forgetting they were ever meant to stay open. Mid-century efforts improved only marginally. Larger machines arrived, but understanding lagged behind power. Rock was cut faster, yet its behavior remained unpredictable. Slopes failed years after completion. Drainage was guessed at, not calculated. Anchoring methods assumed stability that did not exist. In some cases, the road survived just long enough to prove the idea flawed. Accidents accumulated. Insurance costs rose. Political support dissolved. It became easier to abandon the route than to justify its continued repair. The mountain reclaimed what had been taken. These failures were not remembered as bold experiments. They were recorded as warnings. Each collapsed ledge reinforced the belief that vertical cliffs were limits, not challenges. Engineers learned where not to build, not how to build better. By the late 20th century, the idea of slicing roads into sheer rock carried institutional memory of loss. Not moral opposition, but technical fatigue. Too many attempts had ended the same way. Too much effort for too little permanence. What changed was not ambition. It was the understanding that failure had not come from daring too much, but from knowing too little. The shift did not arrive as a single invention. It arrived as alignment. By the time engineers returned to the cliff, they were no longer guessing at the mountain's behavior. They could see it before touching it. Geological imaging mapped fractures buried deep inside the rock. Computer models simulated stress over decades, not months. The cliff was no longer a surface. It became a system with rules. Cutting tools evolved alongside understanding. Drilling was slower, more deliberate. Explosives were placed with restraint. not force shaped to separate rock, rather than shatter it. Each blast was designed to fail predictably. What fell was intended to fall. Anchoring changed the equation entirely. Steel did not simply support the road, it stitched the mountain together. Long tendons drilled deep into stable layers, transferred load away from the exposed face. The cliff was no longer trusted to hold itself. It was reinforced like a structure. Data followed the road after construction. Sensors embedded in rock and pavement measured movement too small for human perception. Stress, moisture, temperature, everything that once surprised engineers was now tracked continuously. Failure stopped being sudden. It became gradual, observable, negotiable. Perhaps most critically, construction no longer relied on permanence. These roads were designed with the assumption that the mountain would continue to move. Maintenance was no longer an admission of error. It was part of the system's rhythm. What had changed was not the willingness to cut into cliffs. That impulse had always existed. What changed was confidence, not in dominance over nature, but in managing risk over time. The mountain was still dangerous. Gravity had not softened, but uncertainty had narrowed enough to act. And in infrastructure, that difference is everything. Standing at the base of the cliff, the road is not visible. Only the machinery is. Cranes extend outward into open air, their cables disappearing upward, pulling platforms that carry men drills and steel. From below, the operation looks less like road building and more like industrial mountaineering. Work begins long before asphalt exists. Access itself must be constructed. Temporary anchors are drilled into the rock so crews can hang where there is no ground. Every tool is tethered. Every movement is deliberate. A dropped wrench does not land. It vanishes. The mountain is cut in stages, not sliced but peeled. Thin layers are removed to expose how the rock responds. Some sections fracture cleanly. Others resist absorbing energy until released along hidden seams. Each response alters the plan. Progress is not linear. It advances, pauses, retreats, then advances again. Material never stops moving. What is cut away must be lowered, sorted, hauled, and disposed of. Tons of stone leave the cliff every day, traveling downward by cable conveyor or gravity-controlled descent. Nothing falls freely. Even waste is managed because uncontrolled debris reshapes the slope below and introduces new risk. As the ledge takes form, reinforcement begins immediately. Steel anchors are drilled deep into stable layers behind the exposed face. They are tensioned precisely, calibrated to carry loads a rock cannot. Shotcrete seals fractures not to beautify the surface, but to slow water, to delay erosion, to buy time. The roadbed grows outward, inch by inch. There is no room for excess. Every meter must justify itself structurally. Drainage channels are carved directly into stone, guiding water away before it can accumulate weight or freeze. Nothing is decorative. Every line exists because something failed here once before. Weather dictates the rhythm. Wind shuts down cranes without warning. Temperature swings alter material behavior. Rain changes everything. Crews learn to read the mountain like a schedule, anticipating when it will allow work and when it will refuse it. Delays are expected. Surprises are not. From above, the view is different. The road appears as a thin scar barely wide enough to register. Vehicles, when they arrive, will look misplaced. Their scale contradicts the effort behind them. Months of drilling and anchoring to support a few meters of pavement. Construction zones stretch for years. Crews rotate, machines age visibly. The cliff does not care. It remains unmoved by deadlines, budgets, or ceremonies. Progress is measured not in speed, but in survival without incident. When asphalt finally arrives, it feels almost anticlimactic. A surface laid where no surface belonged. Guardrails bolted into reinforced stone. Lines painted with the same standard equipment used on flat land hundreds of miles away. Normality imposed carefully. But the work does not end when traffic begins. Inspection becomes constant. Sensors relay data day and night. Tiny shifts trigger alerts. Maintenance crews return to the cliff regularly, not to fix failure, but to prevent it from becoming visible. What emerges is not a road in the traditional sense. It is an ongoing negotiation between gravity, stone steel, and movement. A system that only works if attention never leaves it. Seen from a distance, it looks permanent. Up close, it is clearly alive. Once the road opens, the change is not announced. It settles in, gradually reshaping routines before anyone names it. Travel times shorten first. A drive that once required planning becomes ordinary. Deliveries arrive when expected, not when conditions allow. Schedules tighten. Reliability replaces patience. For drivers who use the route daily, the cliff fades into background. What once demanded focus becomes familiar. The exposure is still there, but it is absorbed into muscle memory. Hands adjust automatically in crosswinds. Eyes track rock faces without conscious thought. Risk does not disappear. It becomes normalized. In nearby towns, effects accumulate quietly. Emergency response improves by minutes that later prove decisive. Construction materials arrive without detours. Seasonal isolation loosens its grip. Businesses adjust inventory downward because delays are no longer assumed. Small efficiencies compound. For workers who built the road, the relationship is different. They see anchors where others see concrete. They notice drainage stains. Hairline cracks the color of repaired rock. The cliff never becomes scenery. It remains a responsibility they helped create. New traffic follows. Tourism increases cautiously at first. The road becomes part of the landscape story, not a secret passage, but a visible statement. Some communities welcome it as connection. Others tolerate it as inevitability. Few remain indifferent. At a national level, the change is barely perceptible. Freight moves slightly faster. Routes simplify. Redundancy shrinks. The system absorbs the improvement without ceremony. The benefit is real, but diffuse, another small correction in a network too large to feel gratitude. Yet dependence forms quickly. Once the road exists, alternatives fade. Closing it becomes unthinkable, even temporarily. What was once a risky experiment hardens into expectation. The cliff road does not just change how people move, it changes what they assume movement should cost. Part 7. People and Daily Life. 330 words. Once the road opens, the change is not announced. It settles in, gradually reshaping routines before anyone names it. Travel times shorten first. A drive that once required planning becomes ordinary. Deliveries arrive when expected, not when conditions allow. Schedules tighten. Reliability replaces patience. For drivers who use the route daily, the cliff fades into background. What once demanded focus becomes familiar. The exposure is still there, but it is absorbed into muscle memory. Hands adjust automatically in crosswinds. Eyes track rock faces without conscious thought. Risk does not disappear. It becomes normalized. In nearby towns, effects accumulate quietly. Emergency response improves by minutes that later prove decisive. Construction materials arrive without detours. Seasonal isolation loosens its grip. Businesses adjust inventory downward because delays are no longer assumed. Small efficiencies compound. For workers who built the road, the relationship is different. They see anchors where others see concrete. They notice drainage stains. Hairline cracks the color of repaired rock. The cliff never becomes scenery. It remains a responsibility they helped create. New traffic follows. Tourism increases cautiously at first. The road becomes part of the landscape story, not a secret passage, but a visible statement. Some communities welcome it as connection. Others tolerate it as inevitability. Few remain indifferent. At a national level, the change is barely perceptible. Freight moves slightly faster. Routes simplify. Redundancy shrinks. The system absorbs the improvement without ceremony. The benefit is real, but diffuse, another small correction in a network too large to feel gratitude. Yet dependence forms quickly. Once the road exists, alternatives fade. Closing it becomes unthinkable, even temporarily. What was once a risky experiment hardens into expectation. The cliff road does not just change how people move. It changes what they assume movement should cost. The road's existence does not end debate. It concentrates it. Environmental concerns surface first. Cutting into cliffs alters drainage patterns that evolved over millennia. Water redirected along concrete channels no longer feeds the same soils below. Rock faces, sealed for stability, change how plants and insects reclaim space. What looks static from the road is dynamic everywhere else. Safety arguments never fully resolve. Even with monitoring, failure remains possible. A single anchor compromised by corrosion, a fracture that propagates faster than models predict. The question is not whether risk exists, but how much risk society is willing to normalize in exchange for efficiency. Cost follows closely behind. These roads demand perpetual investment. Inspection never stops. Repairs are expected, not exceptional. Critics argue that funds would travel further elsewhere, improving broader networks instead of sustaining a few dramatic segments. Supporters counter that geography does not distribute needs evenly, and neither should infrastructure. There is also precedent. Once a cliff is cut successfully, it becomes easier to justify cutting the next one. Boundaries shift subtly. What was once considered excessive becomes merely expensive. What was once rejected becomes viable under the right conditions. Local opposition appears in quieter forms. Some residents resist the traffic, the visibility, the transformation of places that once felt unreachable. Others worry that dependence on a single engineered solution replaces resilience with vulnerability. When everything flows through one line carved into stone, failure becomes concentrated. None of these arguments dominate completely. They coexist, unresolved cycling, through public hearings reports and maintenance budgets. The road continues to operate while the discussion remains open. What unsettles critics most is not what has been done, but how easily it becomes normal, how quickly a cut cliff is accepted as just another route on the map. The road holds, for now. Vehicles continue to pass along a line carved into space that once resisted movement entirely. Sensors report stability. Crews perform maintenance. Budgets renew. The system works as designed. But infrastructure does not end when construction ends. It extends into decades that cannot be fully modeled. Rock weathers, climate shifts, traffic patterns evolve. What was once an edge case becomes routine, then indispensable. If mountains can be cut to preserve efficiency, where does the logic stop? If maintenance becomes permanent, does permanence lose meaning? And if a society grows accustomed to reshaping geography to avoid delay, how does it respond when delay becomes unavoidable again? These roads do not answer those questions. They only pose them silently every time a vehicle passes with nothing beneath it but air. The cliff has been split. The decision remains in motion.